Our first panelist joining us is Paulo Pagliari. Dr. Pagliari is a PhD working at the University of Minnesota as Associate Professor Extension Soil Scientist, serving Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, and housed at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center for the last 12 years. Paulo's research focus is developing management practices that maximize soil nutrient cycling to minimize the reliance on synthetic fertilizer inputs in organic and conventional crop systems. His area of practice include the use of grazing, cover crops, and biological products that can enhance soil microbial communities. Please take your spot on the panel. Tom Peters is the Extension sugar beet agronomist and weed control specialist at North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota, supporting farmers growing sugar beet in Minnesota and North Dakota. Tom joined NDSU and the University of Minnesota in 2014 following a 25-year career in the industry. Tom's a Minnesota native, receiving his BS degree in agronomy and soil science at the University of Minnesota, his MS degree from the University of Nebraska, and his PhD from North Dakota State University. Tom's research interests are integrated weed management, including nurse and cover crops, and inter-row cultivation complementing pre- and post-herbicides in sugar beet, as well as weed control in crops in sequence to the sugar beet. Dr. Ashok Chanda has 11 years of experience as a professional plant pathologist. He's currently serving as Associate Professor and Extension sugar beet pathologist in the Department of Plant Pathology at the University of Minnesota and Northwest Outreach and Outreach Center. He has extensive research experience in developing DNA-based detection technologies for fungal pathogens of soybeans, rice, and sugar beet, and developing integrated disease management approaches for the soil-borne root diseases and foliar diseases of sugar beet. He has broad experience in disease diagnosis, designing and conducting transitional research to combat plant diseases. Our final panelist, Daniel Kaiser, grew up on a grain and livestock farm in northeast Iowa. He attended Iowa State University, where he received his master's and PhD degree in soil fertility, researching phosphorus and potassium placement for corn and soybean, and phosphorus management using poultry litter. Currently, Daniel is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota, where he has a broad research program related to nutrient management for commodity crops in the state of Minnesota. His current research focus on the use of soil testing and plant analysis for corn and soybean, spring wheat, and sulfur management in crop rotations, starter fertilizer used in corn, and the use of development of GIS-based technologies for managing crop nutrients. Our facilitator for this panel is going to be Kendall Nichols. Kendall is well equipped to facilitate this conversation, having only recently retired as the Director of Research from the North Dakota Soybean Council in 2022. Before joining the North Dakota Soybean Council, Kendall was a county agricultural extension agent for 26 years with a focus on crop production. He's an alumni of North Dakota State University and grew up on a small farm near Ullen. Agricultural has always been his calling as an educator, working with researchers and promotion of the industry. Please welcome Kendall and the panel for today's second panel.
Good morning. It's great to be here and see so many faces that I recognize from my previous work. As you notice, there's three of them up here at this point. Paulo will be joining us remotely and give the last presentation. We're going to begin today with Tom Peters' presentation. Tom is going to be taking a look at the defoliant for dry beans and the carryover to sugar beets. Last year there were some conditions that created unusual situations that may have affected some of you, and Tom is taking a look into that and will be visiting with you about that. Tom?
So, are there slides? How does that?
Yep.
Oh, okay, good. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to be here. I will tell you that I am not very knowledgeable about dry beans, so I hope I don't disappoint you, but I do know a lot about pesticides, and that's the angle that I'm going to use today in my presentation. So Kendall's right. We had an interesting situation in 2023 that I want to describe and provide you my impressions about. And you're going to see that as we build the presentation. So I got the right button here. So I want to remind you of the list of products that are available to defoliate dry beans. They're classified as either a harvest aid or defoliants. So there's 6 of these on the list. This is a list that comes straight out of the NDSU weed control guide. So what you're going to see here are products that have a residual activity and products that don't have any residual at all. And I'm guessing 1 or more of these are products that you've used in the past. So what I want to do is I want to focus on the ones with residual. I think that's where the story here is. So I'll be focusing especially on Sharpen and Valor herbicides. So I want to talk about, I'm going to go back for a second. We use these products as defoliants, but I want to remind you that these products also carry with them a residual activity. And that's the part that I want to focus on with my remarks in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So I want to talk about how herbicides degrade in the soil. After you make an application, and I don't care about what it is, what product it is, or when it's applied, or what crop you apply it in, what is the fate of those products after they're applied? Well, for all herbicides, I don't care which one you're talking about, which one you're using, herbicides directly or indirectly are degraded by soil microbes in the soil. Soil microbes, okay? So there's other ways, and these are the other ways that herbicides are degraded. So they're broken down by water through hydrolysis. They photodecompose, they volatilize. Some of them are very tightly bound to soils and move with soils. But the one that I want to really emphasize is breakdown by microbes, because that's really the story I have to tell today. So this is a cartoon of how microbes work. It's herbicide degradation. This was developed by the University of Wisconsin. So I'm going to use this picture to tell my story. So a herbicide is applied in the soil and it immediately begins to degrade. The length of time that it takes to degrade, I think, is attributed mainly to environmental conditions after application. Mainly how much rainfall you get and what are the temperature conditions at application. So you can see one of the projections on the map here shows relatively rapid degradation, and they call this the dashed line, they're calling this wet. But I would prefer to call this under moist conditions, conditions where microbes are plentiful in the soil. And then the red line shows a condition where it's very dry. And microbe degradation is a lot less under those conditions, And the outcome of this is the herbicide is above that threshold for when damage can occur much longer. So I want to drill more into this whole business of microbes. So microbes are broken down by moisture. I mentioned that waterlogged conditions are too much. It's good moisture, good growing conditions in the soil. And what this does, it allows our herbicides to be in the soil solution. So not attached to soil colloids, but in the solution itself. So moisture combined with temperature are the recipe for degradation. I like to think about temperatures in that 70 to 85 range. If they're hotter, we're not getting more microbial degradation, and certainly when conditions are colder, we're getting less. And matter of fact, you all know that we apply anhydrous, for example, after it's 50 degrees or less in the fall, or even some soil-applied herbicides are applied in the fall after it's 50-degree soil temperatures. And then I think, I would be remiss if I didn't mention characteristics of the herbicides themselves. They also impact the rate that degradation occurs. And then finally, sorry, I went too fast. So the soil also matters. Certainly soils that have more organic matter influence the rate of degradation. So I want to go through the situation, and this starts in the fall of the fall of 22, and through the 2023 growing season. So I'm going to start with sugar beet. So on the screen on the right is what I would consider to be a healthy sugar beet. So some of you are going to say, well, yeah, but there's some speckling damage. Well, that's right, there is. We get that with our programs that we use for weed control and sugar beet. I would venture to guess that that is the solvent that's part of Outlook herbicide. And in general, the chloroacetamides, especially when they're combined with Roundup and ethofumizate Nortron, give us that phenotype. I'm calling that healthy. So the pictures below that are conditions, unfortunately, that I observed this year, and this is not a healthy sugar beet. Matter of fact, in the fields where we saw some injury, we saw wonderful stands of sugar beets in late May, early June, but unfortunately, we started to see this bronzing color, and slowly but surely we lost stand. So I would say we lost anywhere from 25% to 60% stand in fields where this occurred. And unfortunately, stand loss is never uniform. It's not every other plant. It's in certain areas of the field. And again, that's attributed to other conditions like the soil type itself. So I want to go back to the spring of 2023. So the picture is from in front of my house. That's no April Fool. There's over 2 feet of snow that we had on the ground. So the question is, how much herbicide degradation did we have from January, and I'm going to say through the month of April? How much herbicide degradation did we have? Absolutely none. Absolutely none. So you can't count January, February, March, or April as months where herbicides were degrading. So let's go backwards. Let's take a look at the fall 2022 conditions. So the bars are rainfall at 3 different places. So Campbell, Minnesota, so in west central Minnesota, Hillsboro, North Dakota, and Grafton, North Dakota. So what I attempted to do here is to capture both the dry bean and sugar beet growing regions, at least the portions of it. And you can see on the right, on the left, all of the measurements of precipitation were below normal. We didn't have rainfall. Matter of fact, it was extremely dry, so dry that in many cases our cover crops did not germinate and emerge in the fall. So from my perspective, we had absolutely no herbicide degradation that was occurring in the fall either. So the question on the table is this carryover or is this an off-label application? Both of these are bad. They both have bad connotations to them. So I want to go through it and provide some summary remarks. So in general, and I know I don't have this right, but in general, these desiccants are applied at the end of August. So consider that time 0. If you look at it purely from the number of months, there's plenty of calendar months between when we planted sugar beet. But are there sufficient months for when herbicide degradation would occur? And I would also say that this isn't as simple as looking at averages, either national averages or state. This is what happens on your farm. So you need to manage these number of months or degradation in general using your on-farm or in-field weather data. And I would say as a general rule, I would not anticipate any degradation occurring anywhere between November and March. The 1st of December and through the end of March. So I want to summarize. I want to remind everybody that these desiccants are pesticides. They have immediate effects. They defoliate, but they also have a residual activity. And that residual activity is going to be dependent on a number of factors, but in my opinion, most importantly, microbial degradation, soil moisture, and temperature. How much moisture do you need? So during the growing season, I think a good rule of thumb is 6 inches of rain between the 1st of June and the end of August. So it's a little different for these soil applied products. Number 2, or number 3 on the list. So there are overlap. Dry bean growers are also sugar beet growers, and there are certain conditions or certain times when sugar beet may follow dry bean in the cropping sequence. And I think you have to stay particularly sensitive to these concerns about degradation. One of the families that I worked with on this indicated this has never happened before to us. And they were probably right. And it gets back to the unique conditions that we saw in late 2022 and 23. And then I mentioned this, and I'm going to say it again. The information on our label, I think, is a good estimate of how long a pesticide will persist in the soil. And those numbers are based on good data developed by the companies. But ultimately, how long they persist are going to be dependent on conditions that are occurring on your farm. So Kendall, that's all I have. My contact information is here. If anybody wants to follow up, I'll be here through the lunch hour, and I'm certainly available at my telephone numbers. So I'll take any comments at the end of the panel. Yep. Kendall, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Tom has a unique position. He is both with the University of Minnesota and NDSU, so we're blessed to have such good universities that remain focused on agriculture in this area. Our next panelist that will be presenting is Ashok Chanda. He is research on Rhizoctonia and he's a fungicide person. You have to learn how to say all those words to be a plant pathologist. And he has worked Aphanomyces and Rhizoctonium, but he is here to talk about research that takes a look at dry bean response to drainage and fungicide treatments, how that is affected. And in the last few years, since 2009, the number of acres with tile drained land has drastically increased in this area, and this is prudent research for us as we move on in production. With that, Ashok?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, the Northarvest bean growers, for the invitation. So back-to-back, last week I was here talking about sugar beets, now in the dry beans, right? We grow all these crops. Sometimes they also impact, what we grow before dry beans or after, to do this. But again, thank you for funding this project from 2021. So now one day we were talking just about some normal issues, and then myself, Jeff Strock, and Lindsay Peace, both of them are soil scientists. So if you have any question on soil science, I'm going to divert the question to them. But friend Hans is here, so if there's any drainage question, I think he will take the question. But I will play the pathologist job today to do this. Like I said, thank you for the funding. We thought, okay, it's cool because there was some site that was drain tiled back in 2001. We thought, okay, well, soil moisture is highly variable. I don't think we will never have like any normal year anymore, right? Either it's dry or wet and dry. So we'll just see, what we saw. So this is one of the research fields in Crookston, right? Look at the date, June 25th, 2022. So what happened, that's a Monday, 25th, on 22nd was a Friday. So we got over 2 inches of rain just between that Friday into the Saturday. So that's the situation there, right? So what do I do? Because we have some dedicated technician, they can go and then pump all the water out of the research plots. But unfortunately for you, it's not a possibility, right? Like Kendall said, a lot of you are investing money in drain tiling, right? So let's see what it did. So again, some of the benefits of the subsurface drainage here, it reduces the surface runoff. Again, you're not washing all these nutrients, the excess nutrients that the crop did not utilize. It will help reduce flooding. And also, I think we only have a few days. I think you got to get in the field and get those applications done, right? So timing is important for you for that too. But on the other side, for the plants, so the soil is a little bit warmer, there's more microbial activity, even helps with the degradation of, herbicides as well, improved aeration, and then overall soil structure is really good, right? You don't want this clogged soils to do this. But when we think about root rots, right, predominantly I work with Rhizoctonia and sugar beet, that's a major problem for sugar beet growers. But Rhizoctonia also has a very broad host range. It can infect sugar beets, dry beans, soybeans, corn. I think everything that we grow except wheat is a pathogen. This is Rhizoctonia can actually kill that. So, but in terms of soil moisture, I kept it like low to high soil moisture. It looks like the moderate soil moisture is kind of the sweet spot for Rhizoc. I'm talking to our NDSU pathologist, Malaika there. She said, Physarum is a problem as well, at least 3 different species. And then especially when you start the season with the wet conditions, and if it's cooler, then PTM can cause some problems as well, right? Like I said, two things to keep in mind. The crop rotation, right? If you're doing like 3 or 4 year rotation versus 2 year rotation, that's going to be risky. The soil-borne pathogens, the inoculum can build up quickly. And also, like I said, the type of crop that we are growing in the rotation, that also matters a lot. So again, the objective of this work was actually just to see, we don't have any information about how drain tile spacing impacts root rot, especially the interaction of these with the fungicides applied at the time of planting. It's a seed treatment or in for a fungicide. And number 2, once we have all this data, I think it's nice to see these numbers, how they add up in terms of the cost of drain tile and how much benefit that you get. So that's going to be presented probably next year to do this. So again, this site is located at Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. At this location, there are 4 sites, right? It's a 4-year rotation for the dry beans. I'm showing all the crops that are grown here. So today I'm going to show the data for 2021 to 2023. So 2021, like talking about weather, it was extremely dry. We started about 4 months of dry weather. I have the 10-year and 30-year means there, month-wise for Crookston, and then normal year in August and September, right? So now I'm going to show you a series of graphs here, right? So on the y-axis, I have plants. These are times 1,000 per acre, and then days after planting on this one here. So really, at 28 days after planting, we did not see any difference among treatments, especially when we look at the in-furrows and the seed treatments. But as we move to 43 and 78, both seed treatment and in-furrow fungicides had significantly higher yields. So whenever you see different letter, A versus B, there are statistical differences in the data for that particular time point here, right? Even at 78 days, we did the same difference, but then seed treatments were slightly lower compared to in-furrows, and then better than the check. So looking purely at the plant populations here, 2021. But in terms of the drain spacing, like I said, we started with 4 months of really, less than optimal rainfall for this. So generally, I think the 15-foot laterals, that's the one that impacted the stands really high compared to any other spacing, and also the 25-foot, if you see this 78 days after planting, 89, that was also lower, right? So these are impacting the stands earlier in the season as well. And looking at the yields, so I was comparing now how our yields compared to the statistics here from USDA. I think these are still lower than what you've got in 2021. But really, there was no significant difference in 2021, being a dry year, none of the treatments, even though we had some stand differences early on, by the end of the season, more or less, they were similar. But the biggest impact was actually in terms of the drain spacing. As you could see, the highest 100 weight here was 40-foot laterals, followed by 25 and 60. But when it comes to no tiles and then 15-foot laterals, again, some of these are overlapping with the 60 as well. So moving on to 2022, right? 2022, ton of precipitation in April and May. And then we had a little bit normal June. Again, the July and August was a little bit dry. So it started with lots of moisture, right? Earlier, we were talking about how moisture impacts root rots. When it comes to Rhizoctonia, the moderate to heavy moisture, that's what impacts Rhizoctonia development during the season to do this. But then, we ended the season with a little bit of drier conditions, right? So which also tells that the conditions are more favorable earlier in the season for disease development here. So looking at the stand data at the 14 days, right? So we did see impact of the drain spacing here, but generally there's a two-way interaction here because the drain spacing on the other side and also the seed treatment and in-furrows, right? The in-furrows generally did better. There's slightly higher stands compared to the seed treatments, and then the controls, this is at 14 days after planting. But as we move on to 25 and 40 days, the same trend continued here. Actually, the in-furrows did better compared to the seed treatment. Like I said, conditions are favorable, but somehow my non-treated check is also looking better compared to the seed treatments, right? There are some years you could expect to see a little bit of phytotoxicity from the seed treatments and in-furrow fungicides, but the data is a little odd compared to what I was expecting here. But the same trend was continued for 40 days after planting, right? So again, when we look at the 100 weight at the end of the season in 2022, this is where we saw the biggest benefit from the in-furrow fungicides, right? Again, there is two-way interaction. That's why, so how the seed treatment or in-furrow fungicide impacted yield depended on the drain tile spacing here, right? If you look at those orange or red bars, whichever color you're seeing there, actually you see generally the 100 weights are much higher for the in-furrows, all the way from 15 to 60-foot drain spacing, compared to non-drained, which is on the extreme right side to this one. But when we look at the seed treatments, there is some drain spacing. The seed treatment was better compared to the non-treated check, but in other cases, it's more or less similar. So this is 2022, right? The conditions were very favorable. Like 2023, Tom showed us a little bit of this, how the season went from August of 2022 to the May of 2023. But again, I'm showing from April to September. We started with the normal April, and May and June was really dry in this one, 2023. And July and August, again, I would say it's kind of the normal rainfall that we had, just 23, right? Every year is a little different here. So again, looking at the difference between the seed treatments and in-furrow fungicides, so generally the seed treatments really did very well in 2023. Like look at all the A's on the top bar compared to the in-furrow fungicide or the non-treated check, which did not receive any fungicide at the time of planting, right? Generally, the plants are really better with the Vibrant seed treatment in 2023. And then when we look at the 100 weight at the end of the season, again, really there is no difference between seed treatment, in-furrow, and then the checks. This is all 2023, right? 27 to 2800 weight. I think looking at some of the averages for 2023, I think they are in the ballpark for about 2600 weight for Minnesota, and then about 1900 weight for North Dakota for Navy beans, right? So these yields are more, reflective of what you guys were seeing. But again, the difference in 2023 actually was impacted with drain tile spacing, right? Actually, you can see the 25, 60, and then non-drain really, yielded well compared to the 15 and then 40-foot spacings. So again, the drain tile impacted in 2023. It's very similar to 2021. But in 2022, there was a significant interaction between the drain tile spacing and also what you did. So just to summarize, like I said, 2021, we started with the really dry season, then we got the normal season. Both seed treatments and in-furrow, they actually helped us to get better stands, but by the end of the season, it's just the drain tile spacing that impacted with 40-foot laterals, that had the better yield. In 2022, we started with the high moisture early in the season. Like I said, April and May were really wet, and then, it's kind of dry later in the season. These are the conditions really favorable for rhizoctonia development. We could see the in-furrow fungicides, especially the quadris, that improved stands. But and also, by the end of the season, most of the drain tile spacing, we could see those red bars for the yield bars for, in-furrow fungicide that did really well. Like in 2023, different situation here. Again, we started with good moisture, then it was kind of dry towards the later part of the season. Here, the seed treatments impacted the plant stands, but by the end of the season, again, the drain tile spacing, that's the one that had big impact in terms of the yield. So I didn't show any data related to soil moisture or some other parameters are measured. Probably we can show that in the next year. Again, 2024, we're going to repeat this study, and then we'll find out, if any of these patterns are true in 2024. With that, I would like to thank the Northarvest Dry Bean Growers Association and also Minnesota Wheat Board for funding part of the wheat work for this one. We were only looking at Fusarium in the wheat in the exact same location. We were not funded by corn or sugar beet growers for this particular project. Again, lots of people from different crews here for helping with this project. Well, that's all I got. I'll be happy to take any questions.
There'll be time for questions at the end too. So if you think about a question for Ashok, and we'll move on to Daniel Kaiser, University of Minnesota. His area of interest is nutrient management of crops. His research includes maintenance of fertilizer guidelines and evaluation of soil test methods and nutrient cycling in crop rotations. His research is evaluating nitrogen fertilizer guidelines for dry bean production in Minnesota and North Dakota. Thank you. With that, Daniel.
All right, thank you. It's good to be here. And this isn't a group I've normally interacted with because I've been in Minnesota. Some may know me, some may not. I started in late September of 2007, and up through about the last few years, I haven't had a lot of questions from consultants and growers on fertility recommendations in dry bean production. There was a lot of work in Minnesota up to the point of when I started. So I had largely just relied on a lot of the past data, but with more black bean production in the state, that's kind of where I've been getting more of the questions the last 2 years, and which spurred on some of the interest to do some of this work. So I applied for a grant through Northarvest 2 years ago. We started some work looking specifically at nitrogen then, and I've also secured some work. Minnesota has put some money in through the Department of Ag through a specialty crop grant to get some work looking at phosphorus and potassium. So what I'm going to show today essentially is the start of that work. I'll talk a little bit about some of the goals that we're trying to look at for some of that work, but again, just realize the fact that we're starting just in the first year of some of this study in Minnesota. So one of the things I've been trying to do with some of this research is take inventory of what's been done before. And one of the things, too, that when you start looking at the North Dakota Production Guide and the Minnesota guidelines, I mean, really the main difference is on the nitrogen guidelines. And that was one of the main interests from the growers and the questions we had gotten is nitrogen in black bean. Because if you look at our guidelines still maintain, whether it's this table set of guidelines or it's the equation that we have in the guidelines, a yield goal-based system, which for nitrogen I've been starting to go away from somewhat in many of the crops. And what I'll show you from some of the data from this year is that we get similar yield if you look at comparatively different, we get different nitrogen responses if you look at differences in, even with differences in yield we have within particular classes or across fields. So that's one of the things that I want to see is if we can get away from some of the complexity of the guidelines with the yield goal-based system. But we still have to have it with phosphorus and potassium. And if you look at the production guide and the Minnesota recommendations, our P&K recommendations are pretty similar. And what's one of the other things that I wanted to look at was just seeing, just to get back into some of the older data, just to make sure some of those things are the same. Especially with phosphorus, it's been one of the things with soybean and dry bean. If you look at the recommendations, they aren't very aggressive once you get beyond the medium classification, and even in the medium classification, we haven't necessarily seen a widespread response to the nutrients where we need to be pushing, particularly in soybean, very high rates, and I've been kind of curious in the same thing with dry bean production to see how similar they are. So some of the key questions, again, is the yield goal-based approach. How critical is it on the nitrogen side? I'm not really looking at it from the terms of going to some of the economic-based recommendations like we have with corn. It's certainly something we'll look at with that, but I just wanted to see on how much these yield goals lined up, because again, I've had some doubts just based on some of the other data that's out there. Fertilizer core requirements for black bean. We've been comparing a lot of the studies we're doing right now. We've got navy bean, black bean, doing some kidneys in with that as well to look at different classes, same locations, different classes, just looking at the fertilizer responses. And that was kind of the main goal to start some of this, was to look at some direct comparisons where a lot of the on-farm data were limited by whatever the grower is growing. While there's certainly some value in that data, it's nice to have some direct comparisons within locations. So that was one of the key components. And that potassium, that's one of the things that, probably with a lot of you, if you're dealing with high native potassium levels, you don't have to worry about potash applications as much. But one of the things I've been seeing, particularly in soybean production, is pushing for higher rates on the soybean side, seeing some negative aspects to that. So I wanted to track and see if some of that was coming through on edibles as well as soybean, just to look at, and mainly the questions or the concerns I have on that end really are looking at irrigated production, low K soils where we would recommend higher rates in those situations, whether or not we're seeing any detrimental impacts like we would see with soybeans. So that was kind of the one. Again, the P and the K, these are new stuff this year, so I don't have a lot to share. But again, this is kind of the starting point for some of those guidelines. So the research work this year, we had trials. In 2022, we had trials on farm sites that was mostly around Chippewa, Candy, Ojai County. We had an irrigated site north of the metro, close to St. Cloud. That was just to get things going for production. We focused this last year on some of our experimental sites, getting to the point where we could actually plant the different classes side by side within fields. Because again, that becomes difficult for a grower to do in a large field setting. It's a lot easier for us to do in a smaller field setting, so we can have that direct comparison at a given site to see what the responses are to those given nutrients. So we had phosphorus trials at 2 locations, Crookston and Lamberton. Potassium trials were at Lamberton, Staples, and Becker. So we had 2 irrigated and 1 non-irrigated site with potassium. And then the nitrogen trials were at all 4 locations. The only difference is that on the 2 non-irrigated sites, we were only comparing navy bean and black bean at those locations because of some limitations we had with some of our planting equipment. And then on the irrigated sites, then we were also including kidney bean on that particular those particular 2 locations. P trials, 0 to 100 pounds. This would encompass kind of what we recommend right now. K trials, again, I'm pushing higher rates. And a lot of the issue with the potassium side, when we start talking about some of these yield deficits, it's really coming from the chloride aspect of the potash. And that's what we see. I've got a lot of data on that with where it's a benefit to some crops, or some crops are a little bit more sensitive to over-application. So right now I'm not seeing anything on edibles on that because we don't have the data. But for soybean, we know. And then there's some work Dave Franzen had out of North Dakota on corn, where we're seeing some yield depressions with higher potash rates. And a lot of what I've been looking at on the side of trying to get around some of these issues comes within applications within the rotation. So again, I can talk probably another 20 minutes about that, but I don't have any of that data. And that's one thing that I'll put a plug in for our Minnesota crop news. A lot of these things I talk about, and we'll have some news releases on some of these things if you have any further questions or anything. That's a good resource for some of these things, particularly nutrient management related. So looking at phosphorus this year, really no response. And it's one of the things, a lot of these sites, if you look at the soil test values, we're in that medium classification, Lamberton slightly higher, so it's a situation where I wouldn't have expected anything. If we did see anything, if you look at our recommendations right now, medium classifications, again, the North Dakota, Minnesota recommendations line up pretty well, about 30 pounds, P205, and that's pretty consistent with what we found this year, at least at the Crookston site, but there wasn't a whole lot in terms of response for that. But again, this is the first year, compile more data, add some of the older data, and we'll kind of see where that goes, because I'm kind of interested to see where the phosphorus response tends to drop off, seeing if that fits with how we have our classifications and our current guidelines. And I wouldn't really expect a whole lot of difference in the classes when it comes to P and K. I mean, really with K, if it's an issue, it might be on that chloride side. If one of the classes are more sensitive to the other, that's one of the things I don't know. But again, that's one of the things we're trying to follow up on. And with potassium, really looking at no response as well at any of the given locations this year. And really no negative response. So that was one of the things, again, we were looking at. And I was especially concerned about at our irrigated sites because it's one of the things we see with our irrigation water, a lot of chloride in some of the well water that it tends to, if we have issues with some crops that are sensitive to it, it can compound some of the issues when we start looking at some of the higher rates of potash. But again, that's a whole nother day I could talk about some of that, but really nothing to report at this point and really no response. So it kind of follows with the guidelines, at least with what we have now. But again, this will be just a continual evaluation as we move forward. So general thoughts right now, I think things are pretty accurate, but time will tell on that. I need to go dig through some of the older data that George Ream collected before I came into Minnesota, just to compare some of the results, just to see when some of the last data was. But we'll just continue to go. And with a specialty crop, that block grant through MDA, that at least gives me the opportunity to do this and keep some of this data moving forward. So we'll see current data right now on K. Really, we don't really recommend anything when it exceeds upon 80 part per million. We'll kind of see where that's at. I've been looking a lot at potassium the last few years in multiple crops. So on the Minnesota side things, I know the North Dakota recommendations changed pretty significantly with some of what was looked at with some of this clay speciation work. I'm looking at some of the same things in Minnesota because it's one of the things that's challenging when you growers are dealing with the situations when you're so close to borders. You look at the different guidelines and it's kind of a question mark of what to use. So it's kind of nice to have some, and that's what I've been trying to do, is get more consistent terminology within some of our guidelines, no matter what crop it is, from one state to the next. So at least you can kind of make some decisions that have some of the same things in play. So nitrogen, I'm just going to quickly go through a couple things here. Again, we had some initial research in 2022. These were on-farm trials, just 0 to 150 pounds of nitrogen, looking at simple rate studies. Majority of the sites were black bean, except for we had one field site that was navy bean at those given locations. And looking at the data, I mean, a significant response to nitrogen, up to about 90 to maybe 120 pounds at the on-farm sites. I've also been working with Central Lakes College on this project as a joint project to look at. They had some questions on some of their split timings and some of their rates, but there's not a lot really to show right now. So we've got, that's an ongoing project that'll have summarized in the Northarvest report for this year. Again, the 2023 data, this is when we started looking more at the comparisons between the different classes at the individual sites. This is where I'll be doing looking forward with the next 2 years. We'll be looking at some of the same studies where I can compare the responses at the given locations. Staples and Becker, not a whole lot of nitrogen response, even though some of the, if you look at some of the plots early on, you could really pick out the control plots and some of the low end plots. With the yellowing, it just didn't really bear out in the end when we started looking at some of the yield data coming off these fields. Looking at the other two locations, very strong responses at Crookston, upwards to 110 to 120 pounds of nitrogen. Pretty similar to the responses, though, between the navy and the black beans. The interesting thing here, if you look at the overall yield level at Lamberton versus Crookston, is that the nitrogen responses were roughly the same within that. So again, that's kind of the questioning I have. And most of the growers I talk to and the consultants are generally targeting a single rate anyway, that I don't know how much the overall expected yield or yield goal actually factors into the decision. But looking at some of the data we have, this is really, I think, the goal of a lot of this research, to see if that's really something you need to be thinking about, or just thinking about a set rate of N. And all these were non-inoculated sites, and we talked to a lot of the growers that we were working with. None of them were really inoculating their beans within many of these fields. So, you know, that's kind of the thing. Looking forward, I think, is the key question, and then looking at how this data compares to what's in that North Dakota production guide. It's interesting that you look at the Crookston data, that we get to see some differences in terms of what we'd have for expected maybe nitrogen rate response. But time will tell on this, and we'll kind of see. Again, this is kind of a project that will hopefully get a couple more years of data and to be able to build on some of these results. So again, I want to put a plug in for the Minnesota Crop News, because you know, it's where a lot of the information through our nutrient management group, we tend to try to have weekly posts on different topics. So if you are interested in any of the data that's going on across the state, we've got several nutrient management specialists located across the state. It's really the source that we tend to use in terms of trying to get information out to growers as to what's going on with current projects. And if any of you do have any questions, I'll be around through lunch, but my contact information is there at the bottom, and also the web address to get to where the bottom is where our nutrient management guidelines are. I spent a fair amount of time in the last year going through and just looking at not necessarily updating all the guidelines, but just going through the publications to correct any issues we had, and then make any changes that had come up that we needed to make. So most of that has been updated, but for dry beans, there really hasn't been any major changes, I think, in the state since before I started here. And there's been a few questions on the nutrient side. So that's what I have. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. Fertilizer has become a very expensive input in the last 20 years. I hate to say what I was selling fertilizer for in the mid-'80s, if you remember back that far, and it certainly was many times less than what it is now. Nitrogen has gone up in expense, and our next speaker, Paulo Pagliari, is from the University of Minnesota. His research is focused on gaining better understanding of the relationship between soil fertilizer and soil biological processes, and how this interaction affects crop yield. So anything that we can use to reduce the amount of inputs would be great. Paulo will be presenting remotely, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our people in the back, and hopefully they have Paulo on.
started doing some of the work with the bacteria from Brazil up here in Minnesota. I got a permit from USDA to import the bacteria, and we started doing some work with funding from the Minnesota wheat growers and also the corn growers. So I did also submitted a couple proposals to the Northarvest, but we were not able to get any funding there. And then through the FRAC and the MDA, we were able to get this project funded. So this was the first year in 2023, and then we have 2 more years that we are trying to secure funding to continue the work. And so the objectives we had a couple different objectives for this study, right? The first one, we wanted to determine if the current yield potential of black beans under 3 different inoculation strategies in southwest Minnesota and in essential sands. We had the sites we had was Lamberton, which was a rain-fed location, and also one in Becker at the research farm there, which is an irrigated site. So we wanted to be sure that we had locations that would not be limited by water. So that's why we added the irrigated location in there. And then we also want to look at different rates of this inoculation, because we started out with the rate from Brazil, but we didn't know if the same rate that is used in Brazil would be relevant for soils in Minnesota. So we had a couple different rates of bacteria inoculation to test and see what were the results of those different inoculation rates. Now, the first study to test objective 1, we had a few different nitrogen rates because we wanted to make sure that we had the nitrogen being applied without any inoculation, so we could have that response curve like Dan showed you just a couple minutes ago. And then we had the inoculation with rhizobium alone, just to see how much nitrogen the rhizobium could provide. We had the inoculation with the azospirillum. Again, this is the strain from Brazil, and that was inoculated alone. And then we had a mix of azospirillum and rhizobium, all applied together. And then again, for the rhizobium, we used the inoculation rate that is commonly used for beans in the state. For the second objective, the one where we tested the different rates of inoculation, we started out with 1x, which was the rate recommended in Brazil, which was about just a little over 3 ounces per acre of the inoculant. And then we went down to half of their rate. And then we also had 2x of their rate to see, is there a difference in how much inoculant we're putting down in terms of how much nitrogen that plant was getting. And we did that when the azospirillum was applied alone, or we did that also in combination with rhizobium. Rhizobium was applied at 1 rate, the recommended inoculation rate. We just varied the azospirillum rate at the same levels that we did for when the azospirillum was applied alone. Now, why do we want to do this research? I think that the main reason why we want to do this is because we saw very good effects in Brazil with all the crops that we tested. And then we thought, well, let's try in Minnesota. Let's see if this technology would be beneficial to growers in Minnesota, because like we just heard, fertilizer prices are really going up, and not only the prices are going up, but there's a lot of legislation that are going to start to come into place very soon, where we're going to have to start minimizing the amount of nitrogen in tile water and also groundwater. And the one way to do that is by minimizing how much nitrogen we are adding in the form of fertilizer. And this technology could supply quite a bit of nitrogen to a crop. So that's why we wanted to really test this. And also, we have seen other research that shows that rhizobium inoculation not always gives any positive effect. Like Dan mentioned, most of the farmers that he talked with and did the research in their farms, they are not using inoculation. And that's probably like because the results are not very consistent for beans. So they're avoiding spending more resources on a technology that's not really working right now in the state. So those are mainly the two reasons that we thought that would be beneficial to do this this research at the state. And as I mentioned, what we are seeing in tropical countries, there is about 25% of the crop's nitrogen inputs for corn and wheat, which turns out to be between 40 and 50 pounds of nitrogen, which is quite a bit, can be reduced when this technology is being used. And then there is some of the regulations, not the regulations, but like the Nutrient Reduction Act with the NBGA. I think the goal is to reduce the total amount of nitrogen in groundwater and drainage water by 40%. So 40% is a really big number, and they want to see that by 2040, by 2040. So if we have a technology here that could reduce 25% of the nitrogen inputs, I think that would be very beneficial to growers in Minnesota and would help us achieve that reduction strategy with a much easier strategy than just removing nitrogen from the application, because then the grower is going to see the dragging yield that the reduction in nitrogen application is going to cause. Again, we had research already funded by the wheat growers and corn growers between 2021 and 2023, and we have seen some pretty positive research results for these trials. And yesterday I was at the Minnesota Ag symposium in Mankato with the soybean growers and the corn growers, and I had a poster there about this study, and there's a lot of interest in this technology, and there's a lot of good work coming out. So one thing that I forgot to mention early on is that I have done, throughout the 11 years I've been at the university, I have done multiple trials with biological products, and I'm 95% of the times that I tested those products, I never saw a positive response. The reason I'm very excited about this particular product is because we've been seeing positive responses with every single trial that we have done so far. And the goal here is that we're using a product from Brazil, and that's not the goal to be importing this product from Brazil. The goal is to develop our own azospirillum. But the idea with using the strain from Brazil is that gives us a little bit of initial data to see whether or not there's potential with the technology. And so far we see great potential, and we're moving on to this next stage now. We're seeking funding to start developing our own strains of bacteria from Minnesota soils. And that's what we want to do moving forward with those trials. So for this particular research, we had black beans that were planted at 105,000 seeds per acre. And then for other managements, we followed all the BMEPs for beans in terms of P and K addition and tillage and pesticide applications. Our plots were 10 feet wide by 40 feet long. The rows were about 30-inch spaced, and the plots were harvested using a plot combine. The nitrogen treatments were all done by hand, and the inoculant was hand mixed right before we started planting. And then to quickly go through some yield results here, our graph on the left is going to be our Becker site, and our y-axis is our yield in pounds per acre. And then the x-axis is going to be our nitrogen application rate. Again, we had 0, 40, 80, and 120 at both locations. And then here on the right side, we have the Lamberton location. One thing that we can see is that there wasn't really a clear response to nitrogen at Becker. However, at Lamberton, we saw the pretty good response. And then, as Dan mentioned, a lot of his bean work is showing that about 90 to 110 pounds is the maximum amount of nitrogen that he found a response for. And that's what we found at Lamberton as well. Another thing you can see is that there was about twice as much yield at Becker than at Lamberton. If you all know, we've been going through a few years that have been really dry, and at Becker, not being limited by water, I think that could be one of the reasons why our yields at Lamberton have been so much lower. And now here we're looking at some of the results for the inoculation. Again, our yields in pounds per acre. And then the X, we have here the 0. This means it's for the 0 nitrogen rate. Okay, and then the A05, that's the zospirillum applied at half of the recommended rate in Brazil. And then the AR05, that's the zospirillum plus rhizobium at half the rate for the zospirillum. AR is the recommended rate for zospirillum and rhizobium, and then the H2X is just the zospirillum at 2 times the inoculation rate, and then here the AR2X is the zospirillum 2 times the inoculation rate plus the rhizobium, and then the non means the non-inoculated, the overall control. Then we see here, whenever you see a bar with a very different color, that means there was a significant difference. And then we see those bars with a changing color, that means that this treatment was the same as the darker color, but also the same statistically as the light colored bars. So at Becker, we did not see any significant difference between the inoculation or the 0 nitrogen non-inoculated plots, but we did see that there was a drag in yield with some of the inoculation strategies. Whereas at Lamberton, we did see a bump in yield there, a trend for higher yield when we used the zospirillum at the 2x rate for the inoculation compared to the 0 nitrogen, 0 inoculation. And again, we also see that there is that drag in yield for some of those treatments that had some of the inoculation. Now here is the rate response for the 40 pounds of nitrogen, right? Everybody here received the 40 pounds of nitrogen, having those different application of the bacteria. And then at this site, we do see a trend for higher yields when we had the rhizobium or the rhizobium plus the zospirillum compared to the non-inoculated plots, which is this bar right here. And then again, we see a little bit of a reduction in yield where we had the inoculation with the zospirillum only. And then at Lamberton, a little bit of a similar thing, not much yield due to the inoculation, either with the rhizobium or the zospirillum. They were similar to slightly less than the control that had no inoculation. And again, we see that inoculation there showing this reduction in yield. And now here is for the highest rates that we had. We had the 80 pounds of nitrogen and also the 120 pounds here at Becker, and similarly at Lamberton. And then here I have the pounds in yield for the controls, just so you remember how much yield we got with the control. At Becker, there was just a trend for higher yields when plots were inoculated compared to when they were not inoculated. But the main significant differences here were that the zospirillum alone ended up in having a drag in yield, as we had seen for the other treatments. And then at Lamberton, we see that at these higher rates, the use of the bacteria actually just caused a reduction in yield all across any type of inoculation. You also see that if we start putting too much nitrogen, we start also limiting the yield. So, excuse me, the data is showing that depending on how much nitrogen you're going to put, the use of inoculation in this strategy is not really beneficial for beans. So, and I think that's why a lot of the growers are moving away from the use of some of these inoculants, is because if you're going to fertilize 100% of your nitrogen, then if you use a bacteria, you're going to be limiting the yield potential. But the best strategy that we see is when we're putting medium to low nitrogen rates, then the use of the bacteria really comes in and start providing other nitrogen that could supplement what you are removing from the fertilizer. And this really gets to that idea that the bacteria should be used to supply some of the fertilizer and not be used as an insurance. If you're going to put 100% of your nitrogen rate, then do not inoculate. But if you're looking at cutting down the nitrogen needs, then the bacteria seems to be doing what we want it to do. So a couple summaries here for what we learned from this first year. We still have to analyze some of the nitrogen levels. We collected soil samples to look at nitrogen when the beans were flowering, just to see what was happening with the nitrogen availability in the soil. We also are in the process of analyzing beans for the total nitrogen removal and protein content in the beans. And we saw this different behavior at the two locations. At Becker, we saw best results when we had about 40 pounds of nitrogen in the use of inoculation, whereas at Lamberton, we saw better yields when no nitrogen was used in combination with that inoculation. And when we saw significant differences, they range between a 5 and a 12% increase in yield for those plots. And the result was mixed between Lamberton and Becker. Then moving forward, we're still putting a new proposal to the FRAC to continue funding of this research. We still haven't heard back from them. And some of the things that we want to do with the NEWS funding is we wanted to look at stand count. We want to see if the use of the bacteria was causing any issues with plant population, because the decrease in yield maybe could be hinting at maybe the plants are not germinating properly, or maybe there's some other physiological problems that is happening within the plant, like is the amount of chlorophyll enough, what's happening with some of the stress hormones that the plants are producing. Can we do a better investigation and try to better understand what's happening with those inoculations, especially when we see a reduction in yield? So the goal is to secure more funding for another 2 years to really understand the technology and see the potential for use. But I think that this first year really shows us that if you're you really have to understand how the technology works before you start making recommendations, because if we're going to use the technology, we must not use all the nitrogen that we usually been putting on a crop. So it will make a big difference, and we hope to get more funding to better understand how this all works and be able to provide the growers with better information on how to manage their nutrient sources. And that's what I had to show you today.
Thank you, Paulo. We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a gentleman back there.
Thank you for your great presentations and the information that you provided about the research that you are doing. I'm Mohammed Erfatpour, a postdoc working in drive-in breeding programs at the NDSU. I think I have a question for both Ashok and Paula regarding the soil microbiome. So you are recommending the farmers to use kind of the seed treatment to kind of fight with the pathogens. At the same time, Paulo probably try to use the seeds, not treated seeds, because I assume it may affect the beneficial soil microbial community. So how you both are collaborating and addressing this issue?
You don't have to worry.
Ashok, you want to go first?
All right, I think I want to rephrase the question, right? we are trying to use fungicides to manage pathogens, but at the same time, Pablo is recommending use of microbials to improve, use or reduce the nitrogen rates, right? I think it's a great problem to have, right? But how do you solve both, right? Anytime you consider a problem, you see what is that's biggest risk. Like when I talked about rhizoctonia, I think that's the one that's going to impact your bottom line for it. But I think the good news there is, you're trying to manage some of the bad guys there. Like, for example, I'm just only blaming rhizoctonia there. But at least with azospirillum and rhizobium, those are bacteria, so which the fungicide should not impact any of those. So, I mean, there is a balance there, but you just need to address the bigger issue between both to do this. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the main thing is what Ashok said. There is the difference, right? The fungicides will not interfere with the bacteria unless there is a bactericide in the seed treatment, which I don't think any crops that we have used so far had any of that. And just to be clear, the dry beans, the edible beans, we did use non-treated seeds, but for all of the other research we've done so far, it's all been treated seeds, and we are not seeing any interference with the seed treatment and the bacteria, which shows that some of those fungicides, they're very specific, right, to what they're controlling in the soil, and they're not providing any interference with those bacteria. I'm not saying that they are not interfering with the microbial community in the soil. We're just not seeing that this particular bacteria are being impacted by the seed treatments.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Looking at the spring and the winter that we're having right now, it looks like we're on mark to have maybe a warm, dry spring. In that situation, Tom and Chanda, Tom, what would be your recommendation if you're going into sugar beet on a field you may have used one of those herbicides dry down last year? And Chanda, when would you put a fungicide on in that situation if you have tiled grain?
So first of all, following sugar beet after dry bean isn't that common. So it does happen. It happened last year, and I talked about it. But I'll be honest with you, Kendall, I spent a lot of time last fall talking about the importance of complying with the label. And to me, it's very risky. I personally would not apply those products as defoliants if I was following sugar beets. So your question is loaded. You're trying, what's the weather going to be the rest of the spring? To me, based on our experience, that's, and especially as we consider the label, I think it's dangerous to use those products and then follow up with sugar beet. So I'm advising not to do that in the first place. Ashok?
So that's a great question. Right now we are talking about seed treatments or fungicides, keeping in the drain tile spacing in context. Like I said, we are so far dry. I think talking to or listening to NPR this morning, I think anywhere from foot to foot and a half snow we are short this season, right? But once you plant, then you never know how the season is going to change to do this. But one thing I realized working with dry beans over these 3 years, I think, every dry bean that you're planting is actually treated with some seed treatment, which has some sort of efficacy for rhizoctonia. So for me, that's not a concern. As long as you buy seed from a reputable, the seed supplier, I think you do have some protection. But when you talk about fungicides, like we talked about, having soybeans in the rotation, sugar beets in the rotation. And anytime we talk about fungicides, I want you to apply those in the fields with the severe history of rhizoctonia, right? So you also need to have some information about your own fields to do that. if you think you have all these susceptible crops in the rotation, you are seeing, some strand loss. The signature of rhizoctonia is you lose like some plants in a row. It's not like one here, one there. You typically see like 5 to 6 plants dying up and down the road. That's the classic. Then you know you got rhizoc. Then you can come up with a game plan, right? But the other thing to keep in mind, if you're using a seed treatment with one mode of action, for example, that sedaxin is SDHI, you can come back with, at the in-furrow with a different mode of action. So something to consider, in terms of fungicide resistance management. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? I realize we're standing between you and lunch. We did get a taker for the keys, so we got that issue resolved. Any other questions? If not, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.